police force is
Good evening. Could I ask you to please take a seat? You can come up here. I'm Betty Overstreet. I'm the Community Relations Director, and welcome tonight. It's good to see all of you here. Anybody that's new here tonight, I just want to give you a little history of Empower You. Empower You started in 2011. Dan Reganol was the founder. Dan Reganol is also the founder and CEO of Frame USA. And Dan's vision for Empower You was to present classes on a wide range of different topics. And I think we do that pretty well. We also, in 2016, Dan put this studio together here for us. So we're very appreciative of that because it's sure made things a lot easier. All of our, not all of our classes, but most of our classes are live streamed. So if you want to watch a class later on, if you can't make it on a particular night and it has been recorded, you can go on later and watch that. We also appreciate any feedback that you could give us on any of our classes. We also ask for ideas. Some of our classes we hold are ideas from our audience. So if you'd like to give feedback in any way or give a suggestion, you can go to info@empoweryouohio.org, or you can tell any one of the staff here. We're also run just by donations. So at the end of every class, we do pass around our little red buckets. And if you feel that you'd like to donate towards our classes, we appreciate that. I just want to take a minute to introduce our volunteers we have here tonight. We have Bill Roll in the back. He's our treasurer. We have Jay Gronke. He's one of our producers. Brooke Sanders is also one of our producers. And then we have Nita Thomas, who is our executive director. And at this time, I'm going to ask Nita to come up and she'll take it from here.
Thank you, Betty. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone tonight. I have to put some of my props down here. My name's Nita Thomas, and I'm the Executive Director of Empower You, and I want to welcome everyone here and everyone online. And the first thing I'd like to do is tell you of a few upcoming classes we have. Next week, we have a class on the invasion, George Washington's surprise attack on Trenton. Does anybody know about that here? I think I got the book, and the book is going to be the door prize next week. And it's very interesting. Apparently, this is the battle where the Continental Army was first recognized as an army rather than just a renegade troop. So it kind of is the one that put us on the map. Is that the right thing to say about that? But that's what that does. And then the next week, we're going to have someone, Dave Williams from the Taxpayer Protection Agency, talking about tariffs. I don't know if you're as confused about tariffs as I am. I think there's a good and a bad, but I'd like to learn more about them. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is our class that we're going to have on October 30th on President Trump's impact on the judiciary. I think that'll be a good one, given what we just had with the Kavanaugh confirmation and all the things going on with there. I think that would be a great class to come to. So if you can come to any of those, you can see them here or online. And the other thing I'd like to say is, if you have a question, we will come around with a microphone. So if you could hold your question until we get to you so the people online on home can hear you also. And we'd like to wait till the end of the class for questions if that's okay with Greg. And now the last thing I want to mention is we do have a door prize, but I can pull the ticket at this time because it's kind of a special door prize. So we're kind of doing it in a different way. It's a really cool door prize.
We're going to be here at the beginning, though.
And I am going to introduce Greg, who normally I would give his biography, but I left it at home. So he's going to have to do it himself.
So is everything working? Yeah, okay, great. Everybody can hear me, right? Okay, good. So my name is Greg Lawson. I've been here a number of times, actually, in front of Empower You, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do it because it's good to be in front of folks who are very engaged in a lot of stuff. Usually I'm here talking about free market stuff and public policy at the state of Ohio level, because I work with the Buckeye Institute, the free market think tank in Ohio. But tonight I have another affiliation that I work with called Wikistrat. It's an online geopolitical consulting organization, and it involves work with a wide range of different analysts from around the world that use an internet-based model to be able to do sort of a wargaming or scenarioizing different kinds of events, everything from economic issues to geopolitical issues. And I've been very involved in foreign policy. Before I joined the Buckeye Institute, I got a security clearance to go do U.S. Foreign Service. I didn't get called up. It was during the sequester. I'm sure many of you remember back in the day when they put all the budget caps in and stuff. And so the State Department wasn't hiring. And I had a second child after that, and I decided to go into some hardship posts, and it might not be the best move. So then the opportunity at the Buckeye Institute came up, and that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. But I still engage in foreign policy. And so that's what brings me here tonight, is something that I've been interested in for years. In fact, my first political event I ever did, it was, believe it or not, a John McCain rally in February of 2000. Now, the people may have different opinions of John McCain. I thought at the time he was, I liked him in 2000 in the campaign. I have grown maybe a little bit more disillusioned with some of his positions as time wore on. But I always will remember, because I asked him a question in Columbus, Ohio, about the Russian fears of the U.S. ballistic missile defense system. So this was February 2000, one of my first ever political events. I was talking about Russia back then. And so I've been very interested in Russian history, Russian literature. I was in Russia a couple of years ago with a couple of my friends, including a big World War II buff, who was able to go to Stalingrad, Volgograd now on the Volga River, but Battle of Stalingrad, Moscow, of course, St. Petersburg. And when you go to a graveyard outside of St. Petersburg, with 400,000 people buried there, 400,000, 2/3 of what we lost in the Civil War. And that was a siege, the year-long siege of Leningrad, when the Nazis surrounded it. And in fact, Vladimir Putin, one of his brothers, is supposed to be buried there because he got, I think it was dysentery or something during the siege. But when you see that, you see a certain tragedy to the Russian people. And I've always thought that they were an intriguing group of people, tough-minded, spiritual in their own way, and that they had survived a lot of things. Mongol invasions from the east, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from the west, Sweden was a global power, or at least a regional power back in the 1700s. So they had a big war with the Swedes. The Swedes invaded Russia. Then, of course, Napoleon invaded Russia in the 1800s, and the Germans invaded twice. People always remember Hitler and the Nazis, but people forget that the Germans actually invaded in World War I as well. And in fact, they were the ones who sent Lenin in on a train into St. Petersburg, which was one of the things that precipitated the October Revolution in October of 1917. The Germans helped facilitate that process, and we ended up with the Bolshevik Revolution, and Lenin and Stalin and a lot of other things. And we're going to be dealing somewhat with the legacy of all of that in this lecture, although I try to fast forward to the post-Cold War era rather than through the Cold War itself, because we're sort of embarking on a new Cold War. Although, as I see the picture of the vice president on the wall over there, I'm interested in noting that we may have actually all but declared a new Cold War on China within the last 2 weeks, as a matter of fact. Mike Pence gave a massive speech at a think tank 2 weeks ago, actually, I think 2 weeks ago today, that was describing a lot of the issues we have with China. And China, too, will loom a little bit in my subsequent lecture. But before I go any further, I love Sir Winston. I think he's a good guy, Winston Churchill. And I love the idea that Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside of an enigma. It's one of his inestimable quotes. Churchill's always good at these things. And with that in mind, I want you to kind of keep in mind that, because Russia is a bit mysterious. It's the largest country in the world by geography, yet its population is less than half that of the United States. It's mostly populated on the European side, more so than the Asian side, although a lot of its natural resources are on the east and in Siberia, which is extraordinarily brutal territory and land, but they are mysterious. And with that in mind, I think I actually will go ahead and do the door prize, if you don't mind, Nita, because I think that what we came up with here tonight, I hope, sort of fits into the notion of something that's a little bit more mysterious. So
Right.
All right.
So can you read the number?
Yes, the number, all right. 2457102. So 2457102. Oh no, I think we have a winner. Come on, come on up. We want everybody to see. Hope you don't mind stage fright or anything, right? So here we go. So wrapped inside perhaps an enigma. We'll just have you. Oh, I've got to untie this. I hope it's a bag inside a bag here. So I'm hoping I don't make it actually, wow, okay. Nita, help. I'm going to make it into a knot here, and nobody's going to be getting into anything, apparently. Clearly, this is why I'm not a magician. I don't have the dexterity with my hands to be able to do it. She tied it, though. All right. So, all right, go ahead, please. Just put your hand. It's no. There we go.
Oh, cool.
So what we have, Matryoshka doll. And now these are the Power Rangers. So these are good, wholesome figures here. We don't have, we don't have like Russian dictators or czars or communist leaders or anything, but mixing one within the other. And of course, there's several more. And that's kind of Russia. I think it's interesting that you can buy these all over the place in Russia with all kinds of different leaders and world leaders and stuff like that. And there you are. Thank you very much, by the way. But I love this Churchill quote. I love what the Matryoshka doll represents. And I think that, again, keeping in mind sort of the tragic nature of a lot of Russian history, a lot of the violence of Russian history, the invasions that Russia has suffered, we think a lot of times that Russia, I think Americans have a tendency not to understand or appreciate perhaps some of the inherent paranoia that sort of emanates from Russia. And I think it is fair to say that there's a great deal of paranoia in Russia. But I think that some of that history that I was talking about earlier is helpful in contextualizing where some of that fear comes from. Now, I think of what we're seeing today. We have a real terrible situation in terms of American-Russian relations today. I think that especially since the 2016 election, which we will talk about towards the end of the lecture, it's of course bottomed out. But even before then, we were having a lot of problems. I mean, you think about the Crimea situation, which I have a slightly different take on the Crimea situation than certainly the mainstream media, and quite frankly, most of the political class has. But ever since then, and even a little bit before then, I guess you could say, our relations with Russia had been deteriorating. But part of the point of this lecture is to understand why that is. What has happened? What happened especially from the end of the Cold War, or at least Cold War 1.0, when the Soviet Union collapsed, to what happens now that has led us to this place. So I start off here. This guy here is George F. Kennon. Does anybody know who George Kennon was? I see one person. All right. The gentleman is correct. He was a famous American diplomat. He was an ambassador to Russia or Soviet Union at the time. He wrote something called the Long Telegram, which is considered a foundational document in the development of U.S. Cold War strategy. It was using the history of Russia. He had done a lot of research on Russia, and of course, that's why he was in the Soviet Union as an ambassador. And so he understood the Russian psyche, a lot of their history, and he made the case that the Soviet Union had a communist ideology, of course, but that in some ways, what the Soviet Union was doing under Stalin at the time was really an extension of long-standing Russian tactics. That in a sense, the ideological overlay was less important than the fundamental interests and issues that Russia had. He then subsequently wrote an article in a journal called Foreign Affairs called the X article. It's officially called The Sources of Soviet Conduct, and it's also a document that expands upon the Long Telegram and is again considered one of the most important intellectual documents in the unveiling of U.S. foreign policy post-World War II. And as we kind of moved forward into the initial Cold War, it sort of presaged the rise of NATO, the creation of NATO, of course, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So he was a very important figure, and he was considered one of the great diplomats and probably the greatest Russia hand that the U.S. had throughout the 20th century. He lived to be over 100 years old, and I think it was 2003 or 4 is actually when he passed. So he lived for a long time, saw a lot of things happen. This quote is a reference to the expansion of NATO in the late 1990s under the presidency of Bill Clinton. I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War, and I think Russians will, of course, gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. And to me, the money quote, "I think it is a tragic mistake." Now, again, this is a guy who was the intellectual founder, so to speak, of of a good chunk of our foreign policy for the better part of half a century. And he was somewhat dovish in some ways, but again, he was not somebody who wanted to just roll over and let Russia get whatever Russia wanted. Yet he was concerned about expanding NATO. And I might add that at this point in time, nobody in the West had ever heard the name Vladimir Putin. The leader, of course, at the time was Boris Yeltsin. So I also like to sort of contextualize this by why do we care so darn much about Russia? Obviously, everybody's talking about the election. Everybody's talking about spies and cybersecurity and things like that. But I'm going to point to two massively important issues that make it absolutely indispensable that we get our relationship with Russia right. The first one is nukes. This is the number of nuclear weapons that we are aware of in the world today. According to 2017, Russia has more, a lot of them are retired. But if you look at the number on the bottom there, you'll see their deployment level versus our deployment level. They have about 1,500 nuclear warheads deployed on multiple different platforms. We have about 1,400. These are deployed between land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-based missiles, and missiles that can be put onto airplanes for air transit. They're the nuclear triad and all. So other than us, the Russians have the most nukes in the world. Now, I don't think anybody is going to say that Russia is going to intentionally blow us up or that we're going to blow up Russia. We made it through the Cold War. We didn't do it. We survived. And anybody who would say that we would do that cognizantly and intentionally would have to be insane. Of course, that's not going to happen. But the problem is that mistakes happen. And the Cold War was rampant with near misses. Misses that weren't even based on intentionality, but were based upon accidents and misperceptions. One man during the Cuban Missile Crisis, one man on a Russian submarine refused, they had to have three officers on a submarine to launch a nuclear-tipped torpedo at American ships that were doing the blockade. These submarines, in fact, I think we already cut the deal to remove the missiles at the time, but they didn't get the message from Moscow. They were underneath the blockade, okay? And we were dropping depth charges to make their submarine lift up. They couldn't communicate back to Moscow. They didn't know what was going on. They thought we might be at war. And so two guys said, yes, let's launch this nuclear-tipped torpedo at an American ship, which would have probably led to an escalation and probably led to perhaps a nuclear exchange between the land-based missiles between the United States and the Soviet Union. And this one guy said no. Vasily Arkhipov was his name, one man. Had he said yes, they would have done it. Had they done that, it's very possible that none of us would be here today, period. That would have been an accident. It would have been misinterpretation. There was another case, 1983. I don't know if anybody ever has heard of Able Archer. It was a NATO exercise I can't remember if we actually used the nuclear, I think we were flying planes that were certainly capable of having nuclear weapons, but we were going very close to the Soviet border. Soviets got very nervous. They thought we might be getting ready to do something. There was a radar glitch. A Soviet commander at one of the silos was supposed to report this up the food chain. He didn't do it because he didn't think it was real. Turns out it wasn't real. Nothing happened, but he actually got reprimanded for not following protocol. If he had done that, who knows what could have happened. You know, we lowered the DEFCON during 1973 in the Yom Kippur War between Israel and the Egyptians and the other Arab countries. At the time, we were afraid the Soviets were going to get involved in the Middle East and get access to Middle Eastern oil. We didn't want that. So Kissinger and Nixon lowered the DEFCON, the rattle nuclear saber. What we didn't know at the time was just how kind of out of touch initially reality Brezhnev actually was. He was actually really considering moving ships into the region, which could have created an escalatory spiral, not because he wanted a nuclear exchange, but because he wanted to intimidate the United States because we were backing Israel versus Egypt, and Egypt was a client state of the Soviet Union at the time. Nothing happened at that time, but it could have. So these are the incidents that worry me. not the incidents of intentional action, but accidents. The Russians don't have radars, satellite. They don't do the satellites. They rely more on radar than satellites for being able to make a determination as to whether a missile is incoming to them. That cuts down their response time. We have longer to decide if we think there's a missile exchange, okay, than they do. So if there's paranoia, which the Russians already have, and we're backing them into a corner in these negative relationships, and then in a tense situation, there's a misinterpretation of a radar signal, could somebody accidentally press a button? They have a system called the dead hand or perimeter, which is supposed to be, if they can't communicate with Moscow, there's an automaticity. It's basically Dr. Strangelove for real. They're supposed to have this deployed. Whether or not it's true, there's some ambiguity, but it appears they did develop a system under the Soviet era, and supposedly it's still operative today in Russia. So I feel that in all this hyper partisan, very aggressive, anti-Russian kind of feel that we've had since the 2016 election because of the concerns over Russian interference and helping Trump, some people believe that. I don't, but there's a lot of people that do. If this thing keeps going worse, an accident can happen, and that really is existential. Second thing that really bothers me is China. And right now, Russia and China are getting very, very close. They used to be close, and they had a massive break. In fact, they had such a massive break that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were able to exploit that break, and we were able to get closer to China than the Soviet Union and work with China at the time to counterbalance the Soviets. Called triangular diplomacy, and everybody remembers 1972 when Nixon went to China. It was, in my opinion, that was actually a great geopolitical stroke. That's why I think Nixon is one of the greatest geopolitical minds of the 20th century. And I think we would all do well to have somebody like of Nixon's strategic caliber in the White House. And by the way, just to clarify, Nixon was questioning whether or not we should change our approach to China before he died in 1994. So I think it's interesting to note that Nixon was quite acutely aware of things, because if we look at what's going on with China today, I think you could see that Nixon might have been ahead of his time. But we don't want Russia and China together. You've got the second largest economy in the world in China, a country that will probably have the largest economy maybe within 20 years, along with the largest landmass with oil, nukes, all that stuff. Not a good situation to have a Sino-Russian axis that is against American interests. Yet we are confronting both of them simultaneously. I wrote an article years ago, actually it was about 4 years ago, talking about that very problem for the national interest. It's a foreign policy publication, used to be run by the Nixon Center, now the Center for the National Interest, or realist foreign policy, which is a little more unsentimental than a lot of foreign policy schools in Washington. But I've been worried about this for years. And I've been talking about needing to work with the Russians relative to China for years, yet we do everything possible, it seems, to get them together. And just last month, the Chinese participated with the Russians in the largest military exercise in the East, Siberia area, that Russia has had since World War II. Now, some of this is meant to be overly dramatic. Some of this is meant to have saber rattlings, trying to intimidate the United States. But I think, and there's a lot of people in the US government that think that Russia and China can't possibly get along because of their history, because of the Sino-Soviet break, because of fears over Chinese taking over Siberia, because they have a bigger population than the Russians. There's a lot of reasons. And look, some of those are accurate to say that there's reasons that China and Russia shouldn't be friendly. But what makes people get friendly sometimes is an enemy of my enemy is my friend. And I think and when you make yourself an enemy to both of them at the same time, that changes the strategic calculus immeasurably. So I'm very worried about getting Russia right for that reason as well. I think that they are the lesser threat in the long run than China. Now, they're the greater threat in terms of nuclear weapons, but in terms of economic power and probably even long-term conventional military power, China is the greater threat. And I think just as Nixon would have wanted to work with the then lesser threat of China vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, it would only make sense for the United States to attempt to find a modus vivendi with Russia today in order to deal with this long-term challenge. So, with that as the background of why does this matter, you probably can't read that. I can't even read all of that. So what I'm basically going to do is, this is the coup. Remember 1991. Berlin Wall's already fallen. It fell in November, I believe, of 1989. A lot of the Soviet satellite states that were in the Warsaw Pact are beginning to slough off their communist dictatorships, but the Soviet Union still existed. And Gorbachev was having some real problems. Gorbachev had tried to open both the economic system somewhat, liberalize it somewhat, and also open up their domestic politics somewhat in order to better compete with the United States. Unfortunately, for him at least, fortunate for us, unfortunate for the Soviet Union, he kind of lost control of the situation. And what happened was a multi-day coup attempt by hardline communists in August of 1991. These are basically timelines of the coup. I won't go through all of that because that's not the most important thing. But what is the most important thing is that Yeltsin was the president of Russia, which was one of the Soviet republics at the time, the largest Soviet republic, but was still embedded within the overarching Soviet Union construct. So Yeltsin does this big thing where he shouts at the tanks and he does things like that, and he kind of famous imagery in 1991. He's very popular, and he basically acquires most of the political power in Russia. Gorbachev does technically come back. He was actually arrested. He was in the Crimea by the communist hardliners, but the communist hardliners realized they were losing the people. They eventually stopped. The coup fell apart, basically. Yeltsin was the hero to the people. Gorbachev was officially the head of the Soviet Union. He was the general secretary of the Communist Party, but he lost his mojo, so to speak. He really wasn't that relevant. And then once you start to see these dates are all relatively important because each one of those was a Soviet republic, and now most of these are independent nations in Central Asia. There's a couple of these areas like Nagorno-Karabakh, the Chechnya, South Ossetia. These are actually sub-regions within individual countries, but you'll see these are when they started to break away from the Soviet Union. This was when the whole construct that Lenin and Stalin had created back in the really the 1920s mostly started to completely break apart. This was the end of our great geopolitical competitor. And then on Christmas Day, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as the president of the USSR. You can see what he said there. Yeltsin gets the nukes, or most of them. They actually had to move some from Ukraine back to Russia. Actually, that was a long diplomatic gambit that took place in the succeeding years. But the disproportionate share of them went to the Russians. And Yeltsin was the president of the Russian Republic, and he became the president then of the separate state of Russia that was independent. There was no more Soviet Union. A lot of people thought Russia was going to become Western. A lot of people thought it was going to become basically a glorified Western Europe. Unfortunately, that's kind of not what happened. Actually, things got worse for the Russians in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. One of the things that I think is most stunning is that the lifespan of the average Russian man declined. You know, I mean, we in America, I think, had sort of a triumphal approach. You know, we won, and particularly we won without blood being shed. I mean, you know, I kind of remember the Cold War. I will confess, I'm young enough to the degree that I sort of remember it, but I don't remember I kind of came of age with Gorbachev around, so I never really remember. I wasn't there with Khrushchev or Brezhnev, and certainly not when Stalin was there. So I didn't have that visceral sense, and I think of what it was. But once all that collapsed, there was this sense that they were going to westernize, they were going to democratize, they were going to embrace liberal capitalism. And they tried, actually. Yeltsin tried. There was a lot of efforts to try to fix the economy, to change it from a state ownership and things like that. But it led to declining living standards. It led to declines in lifespans. It led to the rise of the Russian mafia. It led to the rise of a lot of former Communist Party apparatchiks became millionaires, if not, in fact, billionaires in some cases, because they had access to inside information. So when the state started selling off state-owned enterprises, because under a communist system, the state owns everything, right? So when they were selling this stuff off, a lot of Communist Party people knew what to do with it. And they ended up kind of wrangling their way in there and getting assets that they may not have really been entitled to, buying stuff for peanuts, but then being able to make tons of money on it in the long run. But this all led to a vast concentration of wealth. You know, we talk a lot about here in America, you know, there's the whole fabled 1% and the dialogue that we have in our domestic politics here. They really had a pretty big problem that really was like that. The wealth differential was massive. There's Boris. Again, I actually think Yeltsin deserves a lot of credit. He was a fairly heroic guy, early on in the history of the post-Soviet era, but he had a lot of problems. He drank a little bit too much. Actually, I mean, the Russians drink a lot of vodka, but he really drank a lot of vodka. So, you know, this is basically, and I put this up here, it's a timeline of a lot of stuff that happened with Russia. I'm going to kind of skip some of this because I know there's going to be some questions, but at the end of the day, there was, Yeltsin developed a close relationship with President Bill Clinton at the time. We helped with some loans to Russia. We tried to help them, again, sort of come into the Western fold. Yeltsin, of course, there was some backlash that Yeltsin had to deal with domestically and politically. My favorite is the parliament issue. Does anybody remember? Actually, let me see. You know, I don't know if I actually have the pictures of it here. When there was hardliners who didn't like what Yeltsin was doing in, like, I think it was 1993, and Yeltsin actually bombed with tanks his own parliament building in Moscow because of the instability. So you can see that while we had a good relationship, or at least there was a good relationship between Clinton and Yeltsin, there was all this tumult going on. There was the Russian mafia rising. There was issues that led him to doing that. There was also the Chechen War. I'll also point out another thing starts to happen. Distrust emerges. This is an important map. This is the expansion of NATO by year. And what you start to see is the dark green and then the light green are the ones that are the most relevant. But you see countries like Poland getting in there. Then you start to see actually in the 2000, it happens, it starts in the 90s. I'll start off with George Kennon's quote. So this is the start of moving NATO into countries that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact, which is essentially the Soviet Union's NATO. It was their counter to our efforts during the Cold War. This was a real problem. The Russians really didn't like this. They felt very unstable with this. And I mentioned some of these earlier invasions from their past history. This stuff looms pretty large in their mindset. So the expansion of NATO into territory that they had considered historical buffer zones that would provide them protection made them nervous. Yeltsin told Clinton that this is problematic and this is going to create problems, and it did. But at the time, because of all the tumult that was going on internally, Russia really didn't have the power to do a whole heck of a lot about it. So we began that process of continuing to expand NATO. There's the Kennon quote again. I think that's really, really important. I will point out one thing I didn't put on here, I should have mentioned, was 1999 Kosovo. The Bill Clinton did not go to the United Nations Security Council. He used NATO to bomb Serbia because Serbia was engaging in Kosovo at the time. Kosovo had a historical relationship with Serbia, and so there was a lot of problems there. There was battles between the indigenous folks in Kosovo and the Serbs, and we looked at the guy who led Serbia at the time, Slobodan Milosevic. I'm sure most of you probably remember Milosevic. So we were bombing them. Russians said, don't bomb them, because if you happen to recall, the Russians and the Serbs are both Slavic, and they're both Orthodox, Christian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox religion. And they've always had something of a kind of a close relationship. In fact, going all the way back to 1914, World War I, a Serbian killed the Archduke of the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And part of what led to the outbreak of World War I was the Russian mobilization to back Serbia against Austro-Hungary, who had the backing of Germany. So we can see that the Russians and the Serbs have had a long-standing kind of relationship. So when we started bombing the Serbs, the Russians were not happy. Again, they asked us to not do this, kind of like they asked us not to do NATO expansion. And we really didn't take too much consideration of what they were saying. And there's a famous note where the then NATO Supreme Commander, Wesley Clark, they were at like the airport. I don't think it was in Belgrade, but they were at an airport, and the Russians were coming, and the NATO was there, and everybody was worried that we might actually get into a shooting match with the Russians, because Russians were trying to secure this area for the Serbs. It didn't turn out to blow up into an international incident, but it was very, very tense. So this was, along with the NATO and all this stuff, was an example of America not really paying attention to the interests that the Russians had, and the Russians feeling very disrespected. So now Yeltsin is old. Yeltsin has gotten reelected, but he's drunk a lot, quite frankly. It actually is a problem. His family is really kleptocratic. They steal a lot of stuff. He's afraid of having some of his family members maybe go to jail. He needs somebody to look out for him. And look out for his family. And he wants to get out of Dodge while the getting was still good. Yeltsin was kind of a bit of a tragic, sad figure towards the end. So he initially picked the head of the FSB, which was a successor entity to the KGB, the intelligence services, to be the prime minister. And then at the end of actually towards the end of 1999, he picks him to be president. And that guy is Vladimir Putin. So in 99, though, before he puts Putin into the presidency, there's a series of apartment bombings in Moscow. And a lot of people got killed. It was blamed on the Chechen separatists. Now, Russia had already fought a civil war in Chechnya in the early 1990s because of separatist tendencies. Chechnya is a republic within Russia that is Muslim majority. So there's tensions because of that, and so it was a really brutal civil war, actually, and the Chechens kind of got put down on the mat, so to speak, but there had always been ins and outs of terrorist activity, Islamic terrorist activity. Russia had a lot of bad things happen that way, and so when this happened, the Russian people were very scared, very angry, wanted something to be done. So here's Yeltsin, talking to Putin, getting ready to bring Putin into the fold and elevate him in political leadership. But the second war in Chechnya now happens as a result of these bombings in Moscow. Now, interestingly enough, there's some evidence to indicate that perhaps the bombings may not have been done by Chechens. They may have actually been a false flag operation run by the intelligence services in Russia. There's a story where apparently there was another building where they found people putting the same kind of bombs in the building, and the people ran away and they eventually got arrested. It turns out they were intelligence agents, and they admitted that they were putting this stuff there, but it was a training exercise supposedly. But so that building never got exploded, but it was the same devices that have been used in these other buildings. So a lot of people think that the intelligence services did that in order to justify a war in Chechnya. And there is a second war in Chechnya. Putin is now at the end of 1999, the beginning of the millennium. Yeltsin resigns the presidency. He moves Putin from the prime ministership to the presidency in Russia. And then Putin starts to embark upon the second Chechen war. Nobody really knew anything about him. He wasn't very popular or anything else. And then all of a sudden, because of this conflict in Chechnya, his popularity blew up real fast. He was very blunt about what he was going to do to the people. And because everybody was, of course, scared, thinking that this had happened to them with these terrorist attacks, it was pretty easy to see why he was initially rather popular. So he got elected officially the first time, March of 2000. And from that point on, he is moving forward to try to consolidate control in Russia. There's other incidents that happened throughout the early years of Putin's regime, mostly related to terrorist incidents. There's a concert hall there in 2002. A lot of people who got killed in that actually weren't killed by the terrorists. They were actually killed because the Russians used gas to supposedly disable the people, the terrorists, and then they were going to storm with their special forces. And it turns out the gas ended up killing most of the hostages. And then they summarily executed most of the terrorists. So a lot of people think that there may be something a bit fishy about that one. And then the one that I always kind of sticks with me because I'm a parent and always is the Beslan school hostage crisis. Most of those 300 were kids. There were Chechen separatists took over this school and held them hostage. Unfortunately, again, they were threatening to kill the kids, but again, most of these fatalities were due to the Russian intervention, actually, because they used tanks to bulldoze into the building and the building caught on fire, and most of them died in the fire. The Russians have a bit of a different look on how they take care of things. They're not particularly careful about things, but it was blamed on the terrorists for initiating the whole situation and created opportunities to reinforce Putin's need for more and more power. So while power had kind of devolved some and was somewhat more democratic, and there were local governors elected, for example, throughout Russia in the 90s, in that initial post-Cold War period, Putin now starts to reassert these controls. He actually got rid of the ability to directly elect governors in different provinces after the Beslan issue. At the same time that he's kind of consolidating some of the power over these terrorist events, you have this issue of the oligarchs. I told you earlier about some of these communist party apparatchiks who got rich by buying all the stuff in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. Well, they were billionaires, and they became known as quote unquote oligarchs. That's the phrase that is colloquially used to describe these uber rich Russians who have all this power. And a lot of normal Russians grew to really resent these people. And so Putin starts basically telling people, you know what? You're going to do things my way, or you're going to have some problems. Most of the oligarchs preferred to keep their money, so they played ball with Putin. And he was able to occasionally dress down a billionaire in public, on TV, on the news, say you're doing something wrong, fix this for the people, that kind of thing. And the people really liked it because they felt that they were being screwed, and Putin was a man of the people helping them. One of the most famous of the oligarchs is a guy named Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He was at one point the richest man, I believe, in Russia. He used to run Lukoil, which was, Yukos. Lukoil was one of the other big Russian oil firms. Yukos, though, was the biggest. It was an oil firm, and Russia has a lot of oil, so they sell a lot of oil. And he was one of the guys who bought this former state-owned enterprise. But he decided not to play ball with Putin, and he started funding opposition political parties. Not something that Putin liked a whole lot. He was actually he'd actually at one point was a former member of the cabinet, but he, of course, got arrested because for tax evasion, fraud, things like that. He got stuck basically in Siberia for years. In fact, as you can see there, he was released in 2014, right before the Winter Olympics. It was considered a humanitarian gesture. And actually, Khodorkovsky is free now. He's not in Russia. I don't know if he's in America or I think he's in Western Europe right now. But he was in jail for 10 years. But he funded political opposition. So this was an example of one of these wealthy guys not kowtowing to the Putin regime. I get to George W. Bush a little bit. I think we go to the next phase of where Russian relates. So all these things are happening with the power and the consolidation. It's starting to make Americans concerned about Russia. We had all these high hopes for Russia. We thought they were going to be more like us, that the end of the Cold War was this great opportunity. So we're starting to see Putin backtracking kind of across the board. And so we start to get very concerned. Now, George W. Bush famously looked into Putin's soul upon their first meeting after Bush was president, and said that he was basically a good guy and stuff. And so a lot of people make fun of Bush now for saying that. Interestingly enough, though, Putin was the first world leader to call Bush after 9/11 and actually shared intelligence with the United States on Afghanistan, because if you'll recall, the Soviet Union spent about a decade in Afghanistan throughout the 80s and had a lot of intelligence that they had acquired. So it was interesting. And in fact, we had an air base for a long time in Kyrgyzstan, one of the former Soviet republics that we used to go in and out of Afghanistan. And Russia did not do, now Kyrgyzstan is independent of Russia now, of course, but the Russians didn't put too much pressure on them for a while we were engaged in the first part. Of course, we're still in Afghanistan today, but that's another story, right? They didn't put as much pressure on us. They kind of let us do that. So when we're thinking of how bad he's doing all this stuff to consolidate control at home, but in terms of how he's actually handling and dealing with the United States, it's not that bad. He's actually being kind of helpful. But the United States, Bush, even after 9/11, so early in 2002, he decides to pull out of a significant treaty that we were in with the Russians called the Anti-Ballistic Missile Defense Treaty. This was something that was actually done in the 70s with Nixon, and it was basically a treaty that said that you could only have a ballistic missile defense around your capital and nowhere else. It was basically a way to leave your countries completely at the mercy of each other's nuclear weapons in order to create the whole context for what they call mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The whole notion that if you launch, we'll all die, so you won't launch. Deterrence. So the ABM was considered a cornerstone of deterrence because it meant that we wouldn't try to deploy missile defense. And Russia is very concerned about our technological prowess in the United States, and I think for good reason. And so their fear was, if we pull out the ABM, we may actually be able to develop a missile defense that could actually significantly degrade their nuclear deterrent against us. But Bush went ahead and pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile defense system so we could actually start to develop ballistic missile defense, which we now have several ground-based missile defense things in, I think, Montana and Alaska and a couple of other places. It's happened since the Bush administration. It was very limited. It's a very limited missile defense system. Quite frankly, if the Russians launched, our missile defense system is not going to do a whole heck of a lot to stop it. But the Russians didn't like that. Again, this is another example of, we use the excuse, by the way, of saying that we're using the missile defense system to go after the rogue states to defend against, say, North Korea or Iran or things like that. But so we were always trying to tell the Russians, it's not about you, it's about these states that might not be deterrable. So we need this to be able to defend against them. It's not about you, but the Russians think it's all about them. So on the so then, you know, we pull the ABM. They're continuing to get very nervous about this. It's kind of is another thing like the whole NATO expansion. And by the way, don't forget, at the same time, we're moving to expand at this point into Belarus, Estonia, and Latvia, which are the Baltic republics, which are right there on Russia's doorstep. And so NATO's expanding. We're pulling out of the missile defense system. Russia's starting to feel a little nervous here. Then two things happen in back-to-back. 2003 and 2004, there were two different revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine. Each one of these revolutions led to the ouster of pro-Russian regimes and the installation of leaders that had a more Western orientation. The Russians, being what the Russians are, thought that this was an American plot to destabilize their near abroad. They really start to think this. Putin in particular, there's a lot of books and a lot of information that's come out from people who know Putin, that this is really when Putin starts to really say, wow, they're not working with me at all here. They're trying to screw me. They're trying to take me out too. And in particular, Ukraine, even more so than Georgia, is extremely important. Now, again, this is 2004. So this is a lot further back than the more recent Crimea issue that we have seen in the ongoing Ukraine crisis today. But Ukraine has a longstanding history in the Russian psyche. The Russians actually traced their heritage all the way back to the city of Kiev. A Kievan prince actually converted to Orthodoxy back in the, 800s or 900s or so. And they basically, the Kievan Rus is a group of people. This is, the Russians actually say that they are all sort of descended from this. So Kiev and Ukraine played sort of a very important historical role in the Russian memory. When Ukraine flips to a pro-Western orientation on the heels of all this other stuff, it's continuing to exacerbate this sense of embattlement and encroachment by the West. These are the two guys. The guy on the left is Mikhail Saakashvili. He was the guy who came into Georgia as the leader. He was very anti-Russian. The guy on the right is Viktor Yuschenko. He was the guy who came in the Orange Revolution. Interestingly enough, you see the pockmarks on his face. He got poisoned during the election by, I forget what the poison was, but he almost died. And the pockmarks actually are a result of his near-death experience. A lot of people think the Russians were trying to do what the Russians sometimes do. But he survived. But Ukraine kind of had a lot of internal domestic problems. But this is one of the other weird ones. Does everybody remember the poison spy, Andrei Litvinenko, the guy in the hospital who got polonium poisoned in England? Well, this happens too. So now, so you've got the Russians getting more paranoid about us, but now you're starting to see more and more things happen that make the Americans think that the Russians are backtracking, right? So there's a picture of him. He does get poisoned. He blames Putin explicitly before he dies. I mean, he gives interviews saying that Putin basically authorized and ordered my hit. You know, there's questions to whether or not that's true. There's a lot of talk about that he actually worked with one of the oligarchs who used to be pro-Putin and then had a falling out with Putin. What I can say is that it's unclear. I don't think we know for sure. The standard, the operating wisdom in America seems to be that it was Russia and Putin that did it. But in all of this stuff, who does what, somebody, it's not unheard of to have people kill somebody and then blame for the purpose of actually blaming somebody else for it. So did he? I don't know. I think it's probably the most plausible explanation is maybe yeah, probably yes, but I don't think that it's a slam dunk case that happened. So you can see where we're starting to see this constant fraying of relations. And so now Putin starts to really show where he's moving towards in the wake of the ABM treaty. He actually, let's get the next one here. This is actually a really important thing. This is a speech, part of a speech Putin gave in 2007 at something called the Munich Security Conference. This is a big conference where basically defense officials from a whole bunch of countries converge and talk and chit-chat about what we need to do. And Putin basically discusses America and what he doesn't like about America. One thing I forgot to actually mention here that also bothered Putin, it wasn't as important as the other things, but Iraq. Putin didn't want us to go into Iraq. Saddam was a client at one point of the Soviet Union. It got weapons from the Soviet Union and stuff. So they felt that we were overstepping international stuff and thought that we were overthrowing a regime. So when you have us overthrowing that regime, and then you see things like the Georgia thing happen, the Ukraine thing happen, he's seeing America behind every overthrow of every dictator or every leader in the world that we don't like. So he goes on and gives a scorching speech. We are seeing a greater and greater disdain for the basic principles of international law, and independent norms are, as a matter of fact, coming increasingly closer to one state's legal system. One state, and of course, first and foremost, the United States, has overstepped its national borders in every way. This is visible in the economic, political, cultural, and educational policies it imposes on other nations. Well, who likes this? This is Putin in 2007. He becomes prime minister for a while because they had a constitutional provision that you can only be president for 2 terms. He puts his kind of crony, Dmitry Medvedev, in office. Medvedev is a little younger, he likes rock music, has this kind of a pro-Western demeanor, talks about investment a lot, things like that, puts a good face on for the West, and so there's Obama at this point. He's getting ready to become president of the United States, and Obama really wanted to work with Medvedev rather than Putin. So there's the Medvedev to the left, of course, and actually, by the way, he's the prime minister today too, again. Well, actually, I'm sorry. So Putin becomes prime minister because Medvedev was the prime minister, so they flip-flop. So the prime minister does domestic policy, basically, and the president is responsible for all the security policy and the head of state. That's how it works in Russia. And so they flip-flopped, and they flip-flopped again. So Medvedev is now the prime minister. But Obama comes in. Obama wants to do the fabled kind of reset with Russia, saying that I'm sorry. Obama hasn't come in yet. August of 2008 is when you had Georgia-Russia conflict. So it's actually during the 2008 presidential election. In fact, this happened right when the Olympics were happening in Beijing. There was a scuffle basically between Georgia, that guy, Mikhail Saakashvili. Most evidence seems to point to the fact that he kind of started the conflict, but a lot of people think the Russians goaded him into it. This is one of those issues where who did what? It's not exactly 100% confirmed either way. The Russians say the Georgians did it. The Georgians say the Russians did it. But basically, the U.S. backed Saakashvili, and the outgoing Bush administration backed him. And what happened was Russia came in, and there's a couple of breakaway republics within Georgia called South Ossetia, and I think there's I don't know if I have the map on here. I don't have the map on here. But there are 2 breakaway republics that the Russians basically put their military in. They just camped out there. And because of that, you've got these 2 things that aren't really states. They're not sovereign because they're part of Georgia in the eyes of the international community, but they effectively have separate governments on the ground, and Russia backs them and has people stationed there to avoid Georgia taking them back over. This is called a frozen conflict, and it's kind of a tactic Russia tends to use to make sure they have leverage in all the countries on their near abroad. So now Obama comes into the White House. He's elected. He wants to do the reset. There's a famous scene here where that's Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister for the Russians, and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and this big red button is supposed to represent, we're going to restart our relationship, we're going to improve our relationship. Obama starts off by negotiating a new nuclear arms reduction treaty called START II. There was a START I that goes back to the end of the Soviet Union, and so this was one that lowered the numbers to basically kind of what you saw on that chart I showed earlier. This was, again, trying to build trust back up between the 2 countries. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'll go a little quicker here. Obama clearly wanted to use START. He wanted to work with Medvedev, but of course, things change. He it doesn't really work out as well as he wanted to because Putin comes back. Putin does not stay in the prime minister's spot. As soon as the 4 years are done with Medvedev as head of state, Putin says, hey, I want to come back. Obama's basically not happy about that. He doesn't want to deal with Putin. Hillary Clinton makes public comments during the election that the Russians are basically, they're cheating at the elections, that it's unfair election. Putin is coming back and he shouldn't be coming back. Putin takes great offense, and this is actually pretty important. He particularly blames Hillary Clinton for a series of, because she criticized the election process. There actually were street protests after that particular election, and Putin explicitly has blamed Hillary Clinton for fomenting these street revolutions. And for a guy who saw the end of the Soviet Union as a KGB agent and saw the instability of those first few years, he's kind of paranoid as well. And of course, he's wants to keep his power and stuff like that too. But the state's very important to the Russians. Stability is very important. He thinks Hillary's screwing around in his backyard. So he thinks that we're trying to do to him what happened in Georgia and Ukraine earlier. So we continue to criticize them. We criticize Putin by name, criticize cronyism, criticize all this. Unfortunately, it got cut off. But Obama signs what's called the Magnitsky Act. This is named after a lawyer who was a lawyer to an American, I think like a venture capitalist guy. And the Russians said that he was evading taxes and doing fraud and stuff like that. So he gets arrested and the guy actually dies in prison. And so the US Congress is very upset about this. They think it's a human rights violation. They look at this in the context of, oh my gosh, you poisoned this guy in England a few years ago. They're doing this. They're letting people die in prison. They put Khodorkovsky in jail. This is terrible. We got to do something. So we put a bunch of sanctions on Russian regime officials. This was another act that told Putin that we're girding up for a greater and greater conflict. It turns into a tit-for-tat diplomatic sparring. Again, this is while Obama is in the White House. Russia is one of their things. They actually banned the U.S. families from being able to adopt Russian children as a way to protect Russia and really just screw America, right? To show our displeasure, we don't send any major officials to the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics. Sochi's a big deal to Putin. He personally lobbied to get the Olympics years before. He helps push all the stuff to build the Olympic stadiums and stuff in Sochi. This was a big moment of pride to him, and he felt very snubbed. And not only that, but at the exact same time, we have the Crimea problem start to emerge because we have this whole problem in Ukraine. It starts before the Olympics, but it plays itself out through the Olympics and is a huge distraction for Putin on his what he wants to see as his golden moment. The leader of Ukraine now is a guy named Viktor Yanukovych. They were trying to negotiate a trade deal with the EU. Russia wanted him to be allied with them. The EU is trying to pull Yanukovych and Ukraine to become more Western and European. But Russians basically kind of blackmail and bribe, really. Yanukovych at the last minute flips back over to the Russians, and then all of a sudden there's street protests. And this is, again, is one of these murky situations where it's not exactly clear how everything goes down. The Russians will say that we helped, the CIA fomented this stuff. We will say that they were agent provocateurs from the Russian side that were intentionally doing this, but there were tons of protests because people were saying that Yanukovych was selling out Ukraine to Russia. They didn't like that. And Ukraine's a complicated country. A good chunk of Ukraine is Western oriented. Ukraine has been part of Poland in the past, been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the past, yet part of Ukraine is very close to the Russians, particularly. So the eastern half of Ukraine is largely pro-Russian and speaks Russian. The western half of Ukraine tends to be far more pro-Western and wants to be part of Europe. And so you have kind of a real cleavage in Ukraine. So a lot of pro-Westerners were coming out and they were very angry at Yanukovych. He flees Ukraine in February of 2014. Actually, there were people, in fact, some of the protesters were shot and killed. Again, this is one of the controversies as to who actually did it. It's not clear, but clearly people were killed. Everything kind of goes crazy. The Russians released leaked audio of one of our undersecretaries of state talking about who we want to have in power in Ukraine now that Yanukovych has left. They, of course, use that to say that we are the ones backing what amounts to an extra constitutional coup against what at that point in time, from the Russian perspective, was the legitimately elected Ukrainian government. And we, of course, say that they were masterminding all of the problems. At the same time, this is where Crimea happens. The little green men, they call them, popped in there. Basically, they were Russians, but they didn't have insignia on. They secure a lot of locations, and there's an important naval base that used to be a Soviet naval base. Once Ukraine became independent, it's on the Black Sea, which is very important to the Russians from a strategic standpoint. They had a contract basically with Ukraine after Ukraine became independent. Obviously, if Ukraine shifted the orbit to the west, that access to the Black Sea could be in peril. Putin couldn't allow that. So he basically sends in people to rally up the separatist elements. And there's some legitimate people in Crimea who did not want to be part of Ukraine. They really did want to be a part of Russia. But the Russians, I think, do agitate for that as well. And they agitate there was an election in Crimea at one point. So the Russians kind of secure this area. They hand over power to a putative number of people that are actually in Crimea. And then they have a referendum in Crimea saying, we want to be annexed to Russia. Putin sticks it before his parliament. They pass a resolution saying, yes, we're going to annex it. And so Putin annexes Crimea. The first, to some extent, forcible annexation of European territory since Hitler, actually, in Europe. So it is a big moment. However, here's some of the pictures. You can see Crimea down here in the bottom, and I'll finally get to use this thing. So Russia and Crimea down here, very important. Now, I have to point out, Crimea used to be part of Russia for hundreds of years. It actually became part of Russia under Catherine the Great in the 1700s. It actually used to be part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and she fought the Ottoman Turks. They won, they took the territory. In fact, and the Russians actually have held on to that territory for several centuries. There was a Crimean War, and they fought the British. Charge of the Light Brigade is from the Crimean War. It's a famous poem. But that was all when it was in Russia. In the 60s, Khrushchev, who was Ukrainian, and he was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, he turned Crimea over to Ukraine administratively. But it was all part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine was like, it'd be like Michigan giving us territory, but we're still part of the United States. So it didn't really matter from a substantive standpoint at the time. But obviously it mattered a lot more when Ukraine became a separate sovereign state in the aftermath of the Cold War. But it's important to remember that Crimea was Russian for several hundred years. So Crimea over in March, they become annexed into Russia. The rest of the world doesn't recognize it. Only the Russians do. And then we start to see other conflicts here in these two republics or regions, Donetsk, Lugansk. This area is generally pro-Russian, some pro-Russian elements here, but this is more the pro-Western area. The new Ukrainian government doesn't want that, so they send troops into these disputed areas, and we basically have a massive stalemate that's still going on to this day, where we've got Russian troops or Russian-backed separatists and things like that in these regions, and we are sending weapons to the Ukrainians, the Western Ukrainians, to fight the rebels who are backed by the Russians now. So that's where we are now. And of course, the Russians intervened in Syria, which has created some additional things. This is when the Americans finally said, oh my God, Russia's everywhere. They're in Ukraine. Of course, there was the incident where they shot down the plane, or the rebels, we think, shot down that Malaysian Airlines over, and that was a big international incident. That, of course, further created problems for America and Russia. They go into Syria, they back Assad. The West says Assad is a horrible guy. I had a good conversation earlier, right before I started my lecture, about Syria. That's a whole complicated story in and of itself, but Russia backs them. We're not happy about that. And of course, now we have 2016, and we have the election. And we have what the media says is what Russia does, right? So, you know, there you go. The media and the Democrats can't believe Hillary lost. They're going to blame everything on Putin. And of course, Trump is Putin's puppet. And if you didn't like that, how about that one? And so, of course, now we have Mueller, we have the Russia investigation, we have the hacking, we have all of this. that's going on. And so now Russia is boogeyman number one for the Democrats, at least in America. And, you know, they say that, I think a lot of them must believe this, that he totally backs Putin, even though that actually Trump has actually done more against Putin in some ways than Obama ever did, including he's actually giving lethal weapons to the Ukrainians, which is actually a policy I don't support. But it's one of the few policies of Trump that I don't support, but I don't support that one. And although he is being tougher than Russia right now, even though he does make the comments publicly that he wants to have a better relationship with Russia. So I had to kind of run through some of that end point so we have a little bit of time for Q&A. That was a lot of material. So thank you for bearing with me. What should be done? I wrote this in 2012. So this was over about a year and a half before the Crimea situation ever happened. I've been worried about the Russian-China relationship for a long time. And I was very disillusioned when Crimea happened and our response to Crimea and a lot of the stuff that's happened in Ukraine, because in some measure, I think that we have done a lot to exacerbate tensions. And this is not to say that I think Putin is a good guy. This is not to say that I don't think that he probably has had people assassinated. This isn't to say that he doesn't tinker around in other people's elections. I think that a lot of that is true, but he's not the only one that does that. We've had a history of intervening in people's elections throughout American history, especially in the Cold War. You got to deal with them. And so that's really my message is, we got to understand why they're mad. Whether we agree with their interpretation or not really doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of difference. What matters is we need to understand it, and we need to craft policies with that cognition in mind. And I don't think we've been doing a very good job of that. I think actually the only person who has sort of tried to move us in the right direction on that actually is Trump. I mean, Trump has taken a lot of heat for wanting to have a better relationship with Putin. And Democrats obviously can't stand it, but quite frankly, the entire Republican establishment is anti-Russian as well. Before the 2016 election, Republicans were actually more anti-Russian than Democrats were. And they continue to be anti-Russian. And I get it. I understand why. Putin is a rough customer. I think that's indisputably true. But I think that we're missing the big picture, which was what I started off with, which is they can kill us, all of us, or at least most of us. No other country on earth can do that. That is a big deal. That makes them somebody you have to work with, whether you want to or not. And two, you can't have them ally with China, which is happening before our eyes. So we need to see this history. We need to understand how they see themselves, because only through understanding how they see themselves can we have a dialogue that's meaningful and have a chance to have a relationship that doesn't continue to go down and down and down. And even if the worst case apocalyptic scenario doesn't happen, the amount of money and effort and time we spend pushing them into China's arms is going to be against our interests. And we will find out one day that we spent all this time playing around in Ukraine and playing around in all these peripheral theaters, and we'll find out that we lost most of East Asia and all this other stuff because of our because we've allowed Russia and China to develop an alliance that kicks us out of the entire Eurasian landmass, which, to just put it into context, 2/3 of the world's population approximately lives in Eurasia. It's a big deal. We don't want to be isolated from that region of the world. We need to be able to engage with them, and we don't want one power or a group of powers to coalesce against us. I think that is a critical geopolitical issue. It would undo everything that we fought for in the world wars even. and so it's really important. But I think our present set of policies is going in the wrong direction. Though I think Trump, to his credit, I think Trump actually would do something different. And it's actually one of the reasons I think he's, in some ways, far more right than most everybody on the establishment in Washington. So with that, I think I should probably open it up to questions. We'll see if there's any there. How long do we have for questions? Okay, great. So I left enough time. Good. Yeah.
First administration, I believe it was in the Western Ukraine, he gave up missiles. Can you
Oh,
Talk a little bit about that, 'cause
I don't-
that surprised me.
I don't think it was actually in the Obama administration. There was in the, I think it was actually the Clinton administration. What happened was in the aftermath of the Cold War, and when the Soviet Union broke apart and Ukraine became an independent nation, there was a big effort to try to secure nuclear materials in different parts of the Soviet Union, especially the parts that Russia didn't control. Russia, relatively speaking, had okay controls over their materials, but we were very concerned about it in other countries. And Ukraine was one of the countries. And so there was an agreement reached called the Minsk Accord, I believe, which basically said we would back Ukraine against any territorial degradation that Russia might ever do if they coughed up their weapons and came back to Russia, so that we could consolidate control over the nukes and not have a loose nuke problem. And so that was early on. I don't even, maybe the negotiations probably even started in George H.W. Bush, but I think it was Clinton that actually was there when that actually transpired. And you are correct. That is one of the things that that a lot of policymakers have brought up is, gosh, we didn't do a good job of keeping Ukrainian territorial integrity.
Sorry about that. Before we take the next question, I just want to let the people online know if you have a question to push the Q&A button.
What would you like to see Trump or the present administration do to help or separate the China-Russia?
Well, I think the first thing, sure. I think the first thing we need to do is we need to take care of the Ukraine situation. It's a festering sore in our relationship. So I start with two things. Syria to a much lesser degree. First thing is, I think we should, what I would characterize as Finlandize Ukraine. And several other people mentioned this. Kissinger's talked about it. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's former national security advisor, who passed away last year, but he's considered a pretty significant geopolitical thinker. Made the case in the Cold War, Finland was officially neutral between the West and the East, Soviet Union and the countries, and they couldn't join a lot of those entities like NATO. So I think we should do that. I think NATO should absolutely, in fact, we're still talking about bringing Ukraine into NATO, which I think is insanity. I think it's absolute insanity. It'd be like having China or Russia bring Mexico into their own security alliance and then doing training exercises south of the border. We would go to war to stop that. And so I think it's insane. Now, I mean, this is not me saying Russia's a good actor. And it's not me saying that, boy, it's okay that they have a sphere of influence. But the reality is they kind of do by default, whether we want to or not. And unless we're willing to go to war over that, ultimately, I think that we are being kind of stupid not to do something like that. So I think we should quite frankly, cut a deal on something along those lines and diffuse many of those tensions because the Ukraine thing is a particular problem. And in fact, just last week, a major issue happened. The Orthodox Church, a patriarch in Istanbul, just let Ukraine become what they call autocephalous. It becomes its own separate national church within the Orthodox Church instead of being under Russia. This is a big deal. And it's going to create some real problems long run. But I think we have to deal with the Ukraine thing. I think we have to get it off the table as this pain-inducing thing that is constantly creating problems. I think to a lesser degree, we should also make sort of the same arrangement relative to Georgia. And I think that as far as Syria goes, I think we should pull out of Syria and not worry about Syria right now. I mean, I'm not a fan of Assad or anything like that, but I don't think we should be in Syria. And if the Russians want to take ownership of it, I'm not going to sanction them or do any of that crap worrying about it. So I think those are the first points. Some people would call that appeasement. And you know what? Appeasement used to be a tactic. I mean, it's gotten a bad reputation because of Neville Chamberlain and Hitler and what happened with the Munich Agreement in the 1930s in Czechoslovakia. But I do want to say something that's pretty important. Despite all the efforts to make Putin into the second Hitler, I don't think he's Hitler. There's not very many people like Hitler. Hitler had an incredible ambition that was beyond anything that we've ever really seen. Putin has ambition, but he has ambition more like a Russian Tsar of the 19th century, more so than something like Hitler's unlimited aims were. I mean, I could be wrong, and if I'm wrong, then we'd all be sorry for it. But I think that the chances are that I'm more right than wrong on this, and I think we can cut a deal on it that would be effective and begin that process. That would also allow us to stop sanctioning them, to stop forcing them into the arms of China, to sell oil and do all that. And then we could work with the Europeans to actually buy oil from them and try to split their oil shipments so it doesn't all go to China. And then we would also be able to have some dialogue about what kind of military alliances they want, and we could start to invest in there rather than have the Chinese do it and become the only source of capital Russia would have. But in order to get to those points, we've got to take care of Ukraine.
Sean Hauser. We also need the Russians to get up to the International Space Station.
Oh, that's true. In fact, there was a big incident just this week with the American astronaut and the Russian astronaut, and they had to survive together. But yes, we don't send our own people up there anymore. We actually use Russian rockets to do it.
Yeah, people keep banging on Putin, but because of that, he stopped adoptions.
Oh yeah,
He can
Magnitsky
stop
Act.
that space travel too,
No,
even though they make big money.
Well, I mean, this gets to the point of if he thinks it's existential, sure, he could do stuff like that. I mean, and I think that we are seeing more and more of these things happen as we isolate the Russians. I mean, I didn't go into all the details, but all the sanctions that we've been putting on because of Ukraine, some of the sanctions that we put on, there have been some recent things like the Skripal case in England, the two people who got poisoned in England, the second more recently, and they said it was Russian, a Russian hit squad. Apparently there's hit squads all around the world, ask the Saudis, but with what just happened in Turkey there. But yeah, I think that that's something that should be considered. I think it's important as an issue.
Has anybody seen the documentary on Oliver Stone, Ukraine on Fire?
This is the one where he sat down with Putin and talked to him for a long time?
No, this is about talking about the coup that went on in Ukraine after the Russians came out of the Olympics in February 2014, and how they installed, neo-fascist, neo-Nazis, ultra-naturalists came into power, which were anti-Russian in both word and deed. And they had this massacre in Donbass and all. It's a really good documentary.
I haven't seen it. I'm aware that that is out there. And here's what I would say. I am sympathetic to some of the Russian concerns. I think that kind of comes through in this presentation and what I think we should do from a policy standpoint. I do want to be somewhat careful. I think it's difficult without access to raw intelligence for any of us to know what's true and not true. In this day and age, I kind of call it a kaleidoscope, and this happens in the Middle East too. Our ability to know for certain who's doing what to whom and what actors are doing what is difficult. That's why I think we need to look out for our own national interests and not really worry about who did what to who. Whether what you just described is exactly what happened or whether that's Russian disinformation. And it could be, could not be, could be exactly what happened. I don't know. And I don't think anybody in America, except maybe intelligence agents, and even there with all the politicization we see of that, it's hard to know how you can trust them either. So that's why my view is we look at our interests. And I think it's in our interest to have a more productive relationship with Russia than not. And that means whether they're guilty or not guilty, whether we're guilty or not guilty of some of these infractions that they obviously think we're guilty of, I think matter less than the fact that we need to look to the interests and what is in our interests. So I take your point. I think it's probably useful to look at that because I think that's definitely what the Russians are selling to their population and to other people. Probably the truth is usually somewhere in the middle, which means that there probably were those elements that were involved, whether or not it's quite as dramatic and as bad as just described there. My suspicion is it's probably not, but that it probably was more than what we're saying as well. And so the problem is, though, that if we get into this game of who did what to who, we're going to and if we embrace, in my opinion, a moralistic foreign policy, this is going to sound controversial, but I think American national interests are best served with an amoral foreign policy, not immoral, but once you imbue your foreign policy with morality and you make that the sine qua non, we're going to have to break all our relationship with Saudi Arabia, apparently, over this whole thing that just happened in Turkey. Apparently, every time any other country does anything bad, no matter how important they are strategically, we're going to have to break our relationship with them because they were a morally bad person. Well, that's insane. Anybody who thinks that shouldn't be anywhere near a leadership position because they're not entitled to leadership because they're too dumb to be a leader, because that is not right. You've got to deal with the real world, and some countries matter more than others, no matter what kind of regime they have. So I guess I would say that I think it's useful for us to understand what they're saying, but it really doesn't even matter in terms of why we need to have a better relationship with Russia.
Greg, we do have a question from an online viewer.
Okay.
John is asking for your opinion. Do you think that Mueller will be able to bring forth any evidence that the Trump campaign collaborated with the Russians to steal the 2016 election?
Well, not sure. I mean, I'll go as far as to say I'm not even sure what collusion even really means. I don't even know that there's anything that they could show that would even be illegal technically. I mean, even if Trump said, yeah, go ahead and hack it, unless they literally did it themselves and turned it over to the Russians, I don't know how it's illegal. Now, you can argue about the morality of that too, right? But I mean, I really don't know what could possibly be there. Let's say, I mean, so I'm sure he's going to find something against somebody. My suspicion is that it's not going to directly hurt Trump, or that if there's stuff that hurts Trump, it's not going to actually be the Russia stuff. It's going to be about his business dealings and the fact that he may have done some kind of tax evasion or fraud or done something like that somewhere in his, real estate stuff. This is what happens with special investigators. The last time there was this big special counsel, they ended up putting Scooter Libby in jail for that CIA agent, Valerie Plame, back in the 2000s. That was just stupid. So usually these special counsels turn out to end up busting people for things that aren't even related to the initial thing they were supposed to investigate. I think that is the far more likely scenario than that there's going to be some, smoking gun thing of collusion. And quite frankly, again, even if, I mean, Trump, he said tongue in cheek, but he said, hey, release the emails, you got to release them, and everybody said, oh my God, he just called him to hack the election. Well, even if he did, it actually doesn't from a legal standpoint. I don't even know that it matters. I mean, it might matter politically, but legally, I'm not sure that it really matters.
I've read this a couple of times. You may have the answer. Is Putin the richest man in the world?
Oh, don't know. It's one of those things. I don't doubt that he's pilfered some money aside and that he's pretty well off. Now, is he Jeff Bezos wealthy? Hard to say. It could be. I'm sure he'd be very smart in terms of it not being traceable and under multiple names in multiple countries and things like that. That's somewhere 3 or 4 lines away from him. But I also think that's a pretty good tactic for us to use to turn him into a James Bond supervillain, right? I mean, now he does that partially himself with his pictures and his, bare-chested things and the fishing and the riding the horse and the submarine thing. And I don't know if you remember the time he diving and he found an ancient Greek vase or something in the Aegean Ocean or whatever that was. So he does all of that stuff. So I think he does try to look like a James Bond supervillain. And we certainly like to kind of do that because it makes it easier to get people rallied against him and stuff like that. The simple answer is that I don't really know the answer to that. Would I be surprised if that's true? No, but I could easily see that be also used for propaganda purposes ourselves. So, and again, I guess kind of like the other question, in a certain sense, I'm not sure if it really matters on a substantive level, whether he is or not, but I'm not sure. I could easily see it being either way.
We have a question here.
Yes, I'm just trying to clarify something for myself because you have, I want to thank you for, the comprehensive coverage that you gave us, but there is an awful lot of information to digest here, and I'm not quite sure I understand the Crimean situation with Russia and what we as the United States should be doing. I know that the Ukraine is, Eastern and Western. Are you suggesting it would be better? I know what your end game is, that we should not be pushing Russia toward China, but are you saying that we should allow them to, annex the Ukraine, which they have done, and to be a little more on friendly terms with them so that they will not feel that they have to go more toward China? Is that what you're saying about the Ukraine?
Simply put, yes.
Thank you.
I mean, and again, a lot of people, it's a controversial statement and it's controversial, but I think we have to ask ourselves what is it now. I mean, look, it opens up a Pandora's box because the whole notion is, oh gosh, ever since World War II, nobody's forcibly taken territory. I mean, we fought Saddam Hussein to kick him out of Kuwait in the 1990s over that, right? And I think it is a problem. But I had an interesting conversation with a gentleman over here before I even started, which is about the concept of international law. And I'll put it rather bluntly, I don't believe in international law, not really. I think international law is a fig leaf that we use. And occasionally it's convenient because it makes it look better to act like that everybody else agrees with us. So we go to the UN and we get the imprimatur of the UN to go do something, and it makes everybody feel nice and good about it. But I don't think that it really matters in the grand scheme of things. Law is something that sovereign nations can do because sovereign nations have the legitimate use of force within their borders. But outside of the borders of individual states, who has the legitimacy to use force? Mankind in general? Really? How does that work? Everybody's got a different view on who should have what and things like that. At the end of the day, really, the international arena is an arena where might kind of does make right to some extent, not morally, but from a practical standpoint. And what you really need is balances of power that make it costly for people to engage in certain actions. And in my view, China is a greater long-term threat. Now, let's say China was not doing what China is today, and China was like they were in like the 1960s or 70s when Nixon went to China, and they were weak. Then I'd say I'd have a different view on the Crimea situation, because Russia would be more threatening than China, and I think that we would focus on that because I think that that is destabilizing. I think it is problematic, but I think in the big picture, I think that the China threat is a bigger threat, and we have to deal with that first. And most other things should be subservient to dealing with that overarching challenge.
We've got 2 more questions and we'll have to cut off. Was there somebody here that had it?
Greg, was the essence of your article in 2012 that's on the screen that you felt at the time that we should be pulling back from trying to cooperate, explore ways to cooperate with China? I wasn't clear on what the essence of your article was.
Yes, I was basically saying we should be butting up to the Russians and that we should basically start to view China as our enemy.
And are you pleased
By
with
Trump?
the escalation of tariffs that's going on right now?
In the context of China, yes. I support what the Trump administration is doing wholeheartedly on China. I think the tariffs relative to China, properly understood, is not about the free trade argument. I think it's about strategic issues. I think it's in our interest to rip out most of our supply chains, certainly of anything that has any kind of military or 5G or any of that stuff. I think we should rip all of it from China. If it goes to Vietnam, I mean, I think we need to be very careful because even if it goes to a third party, you could have other pieces coming from China. So we're going to have to be extraordinarily diligent about this. But I am very concerned about hacking of the Chinese hacking of the electrical grid and things like that. And I think that they've proven that they are every bit as good as Russia, perhaps, according to the FBI director, actually more so than Russia. And so I think that this is about, we opened the door, we wanted China to become like us. Under the present leadership of China, which that's a whole lecture in and of itself, but that doesn't seem to be where they want to go for a whole host of reasons, some legitimate, some not legitimate in my opinion, but kind of like Russia. But for us, it's not in our national interest anymore to have that situation. I mean, I think we're going to have to pay more for some of our consumer goods, and I think we're going to have to deal with it. I think we are in a new Cold War with China, and I think we should be.
Greg, we're gonna wind it up with one last question from an online viewer. This is just kind of general. They're interested in your opinion about the future. What's going to happen with the Ukraine and Russia relationship?
It's probably going to get worse. I mean, because Trump is hemmed in politically, and as much as I agree with Trump's general thrust of things, I'm not always sure if he has the strategic. I think he instinctually goes to places that I think are generally right. I don't know if he always strategically understands why he's right sometimes, and when he does that. And I could be wrong, but I don't know if he's going to be able to do it anyway because of the politics. I'm hoping that maybe over time we can start to move that direction. But what I suggested here tonight is anathema in Washington. The people in Washington can't stand it. They think that that's like tantamount to some kind of immoral, terrible accommodation. I mean, what I just said would make me Neville Chamberlain in 1938 with Hitler. I mean, in their minds. I think that that's a flawed vision on their part. And I think that 30 years from now, when China is effectively controlling the Eurasia through their economic control, and we're having to go kowtow, you know, the word kowtow comes from kowtowing to the Chinese emperor, of course. We're having to kowtow economically to the Chinese in 30 years. I think people might say, oh, gee, maybe we should have done things a little differently. But no, I think we're probably going to keep screwing around in Ukraine and not developing a better relationship. And we're going to be distracted with Russia. We're going to have an adversarial relationship with Russia. And we're going to have an adversarial relationship with China. And they're going to work together. And China's eventually, Russia's going to become an energy appendage, a glorified energy appendage of China. Unless we change our policy direction.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for coming here tonight. And before we close, I want to let you know that our classes are put up online. And so this will be up in a day or two. And Greg gave us tons and tons of information. So if you'd like to, you can sign on and load down his PowerPoint, which I think would be great if you could do that. And also I want to thank Greg. Is this guy's knowledge amazing or what? I mean, thank you so much. And thank you for coming.